Hi, I'll skip niceties and proceed directly to my subject for reasons of brevity of time. The subject of my talk is de-globalisation, multipolarity, and the return of the theory of imperialism. I'll try to tackle the following issues in my talk. First, the so-called globalization, de-globalization riddle, meaning why the world capitalist economy passes from eras of increased internationalization of capital to eras of nationalization of capital, a return to national and regional basis. Second, I will argue that the dominant till almost today globalization thesis is an erroneous theory. And I'll skip the third point and move directly to the fourth. I will argue that the classical Marxist theory of imperialism is a realistic theory and which works some development, and I'll propose certain points on this matter. And the last part would be an analysis based on the Marxist theory of imperialism of the current state of international economy. Now, for almost the 30 years, globalization, that is the thesis that there is a unified world economy and national economies are becoming increasingly irrelevant, was considered as an undisputed fact. So economic policies, both national but especially international, and the latter dictated national policies, were shaped accordingly. International policies mainly from the dominant Washington institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, and encapsulated in two formulations, the one very neoliberal, the Washington Consensus, and the other post-neoliberal, actually more new Keynesian, the so-called post-Washington Consensus. In my humble opinion, both extremely conservative and of course serving the interests of the US and lesser to the collective West. This empirical belief was coupled with similar theoretical analysis, the so-called globalization thesis, that permeated the whole spectrum of social sciences and dominated almost all economic schools, even Marxist political economy, although they were always robust opponents of the globalization thesis, particularly within Marxist political economy, which has a classical theory of analyzing the international political economy, and this theory is the theory of imperialism. That is a theory stating that the international economy in capitalism is a battlefield instead of a cooperative and mutually beneficial area, as the globalization thesis maintains. However, all things have an end. So the globalization discourse soon ran into problems, and ran into problems since the very first quarter of the 21st century, and of course, particularly after the 2008 world crisis. The globalization edifice started crumbling, protectionism, unilateral economic policies, trade and currency wars took place with an increased frequency, so de-globalization became the name of the day. And notably, the main promoter of globalization, the US, became the main instigator of protectionism and unilateralist policies. Thus, in my opinion, globalization was proved to be a time-limited era and not a permanent structural transformation. So once again, after the end of the so-called first globalization, that is the period from 1860 till 1914, the international capitalist economy exhibits periods of increasing and subsequently decreasing internationalization of capital. And interestingly, these fluctuations are closely related to the ascent and descent of major imperialist powers. So So the question is what theory can account effectively for this contradictory phenomenon. Now, the globalization thesis, an erroneous theory, in my opinion, argued that since the late 20th century, there were radical socioeconomic transformations that produced a change of epochal dimension, that is, economic activities burst out of national borders and organized themselves in worldwide processes and networks. This was supposed to be the differential specific of the whole contemporary era, a thing to remain, the new status of things. Different theories attribute this hypothetical historical rupture to different factors: technological change, political reasons, the annus mirabile of 1989, the inherent logic of capitalist accumulation in more Marxist versions. There are two necessary corollaries of this globalization thesis. The first, the end of the national economy, and second, the end of the national state's ability to implement economic policies. These economic arguments were supplemented with several political claims, like the spread of global democracy, that capitalism prefers making business rather than war. Both of them are highly disputable, and actually historical evidence proves the opposite. I'll skip this part for reasons of economy of time, and I'll proceed to the analytical foundations of globalization. The dominant theory behind the globalization thesis is the mainstream neoclassical analysis of international economics. This is based on the infamous comparative advantage theory, a theory presented in the beginning by Ricardo within classical political economy, and then expanded by Hexerolin and Samuelson in neoclassical economics by making significant modifications in the Ricardian theory, modifications that Ricardo himself rejected, did not accept them. This theory argues that if you have two countries, developed one, country B, a less developed one, and you have two internationally tradable goods, 1 and 2, and the country 1, the more developed one, is more productive and also more competitive in producing both of them, it won't do this. It will constrain itself to produce only the good one, the one that has higher productivity and higher competitiveness, and so leave the production of good to country B, so there would be a trade equilibrium between them, not a disequilibrium. So free international trade is a mutually beneficial business. Now, there is an alternative to this rather mythical argument, that it is the theory of absolute advantage, advanced by both Adam Smith and then by Karl Marx, stating that no, that's not the case. If country A is more productive and more competitive in both goods, it will produce both internationally tradable goods, and of course this will lead to country B becoming bankrupt. But that's the name of the game. We have winners and losers. The comparative advantage theory is the main theory within mainstream economics, despite having serious, both analytical and empirical problems. International trade, and not only trade, capital movements do not act accordingly to comparative advantage theory. The absolute advantage theory is much better positioned to understand them. So what's the alternative? In my opinion, the alternative is the Marx theory of imperialism. The Marx theory of imperialism argues that capitalism's international system is not a competitive but also comparative environment which leads to a win-win situation, but it is a systemic battlefield with winners and losers. I'll skip all this. I'll skip also several elements about a redefinition of the Marxist theory of imperialism, which are technical, and I'll move to the last point, how a theory of imperialism can explain the current situation in the international political economy. I will argue the following points. First, it's capitalist superpower creates its economic superiority through protectionist means. So the cases for Britain and the US is obvious. Once it acquires international economic supremacy, it tries to impose free trade and capital movement upon its subordinates. For obvious reasons, free trade and capital movements add additional super profits, so-called imperialist profits, to the ones that the superpower acquires internally. The US, however, the more advanced capitalist economies are more prone to over-accumulation crisis because of the falling rate of profit tendency, and so the latter bite into the economic foundations of their supremacy. So this is the main idea in the Marxist theory of crisis. Capitalist success leads to capitalist failure. It's a contradiction that's always working. Now, the US is the capitalist superpower for almost a century. The pillars of this supremacy were based on its economy. It instigated the post-war globalization for the Western Bloc. This was the Bretton Woods system. However, since the 1974 world profitability crisis and the problems in the US economy, the US unilaterally scrapped the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was in a position to do this, so the Nixon's finance minister argued, dollar is our currency and your problem, so go cut your necks. And in the absence of any challenger and with the threat of the Cold War, dollar remained the main reserve currency, meaning that the US reaped strategic dominance and also economic profits through seigniorage. In 1985, the US supremacy was faltering again. Then came the Plaza. There was also a challenger. The challenger was Japan mainly. Then the US managed again to marshal all the Western Bloc into the so-called Plaza Agreement. In the Plaza Agreement, the US achieved A, to depreciate the dollar and thus gain competitiveness without losing its financial dominance, and B, open the economies of its more dangerous competitors, and C, made them buyers of US debt. This, of course, led to the collapse of Japan. Japan has since the 1980s, stuck in the mud, in stagnation. And now the 1989 collapse of the Eastern Bloc offered new opportunities, so the globalization discourse facilitated the expansion of US and Western capitals to new areas and fields, new countries of capitalist exploitation. However, problems again appeared, and this led to a fall in the economic supremacy of the US. So then came the Trump administration. But not only Trump. Trump is not, as superficial liberal arguments say, a maverick populist. Trump represents the majority, the main fraction nowadays of the US oligarchy. They understand very well that the economic basis of their supremacies is failing, is falling. They have to do something urgently, and this is what they are doing. They did it with the first Trump administration. The Biden administration continued more or less on the same course, and The second Trump administration is much more strong on this. Just 2 points. What is the economic project of Trump? I would argue that it's a form of the old-fashioned Latin American structuralist import substituting industrialization. In the case of the US, it's import substituting reindustrialization. It has the following pillars. First, reindustrialize the US economy. Second, preserve the dominance of the US dominance of the international financial system. There is another, I'll skip the rest. There is a particular aspect regarding China, and the EU seems to follow suit there. Just one word. Just one word. What the US is trying to do towards China is the same trick that it did with Plaza Accord with Japan, meaning first to reduce China's productive capacity with the so-called overcapacity thesis, a stupid, nonsensical in economics terms thesis, and also open further the Chinese economy to US commodities. And third, possibly push China to buy again more US debt. The typical Japanese trick. Now, to end this, the US strategy is fraught with problems. It's almost impossible for the US to succeed in both these two pillars because reindustrialization is a long-term process requiring several years, and Besant has admitted that. Second, that retaining international supremacy is very difficult nowadays for the dollar. And the third point with this I will end is that subjugating China requires total ignorance of the Japanese lesson. Now, this is quite difficult to swallow for someone. So the failure of the US strategy will probably bring forward the end of the US supremacy. Thanks, sorry.